Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into what might be one of the most significant domestic fraud cases in American history.
It's a huge
And
one.
it's scandal that has just erupted out of Minnesota. We're talking massive amounts of misused pandemic relief funds, high-profile political figures, and some extremely serious allegations.
Right. Allegations of international finance and even, well, potential ties to terrorism.
The scale is just staggering.
It really is. I mean, we're talking about a level of theft that prompted former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller to claim that this operation is, and this is a quote, the single greatest theft of taxpayer dollars through welfare fraud in American history.
And that's based on what investigators have found so far.
So far, yes, that's a bold claim, and it immediately sets the national stakes for this whole complex situation.
It does. And that kind of framing,
Yeah.
greatest theft, it really requires us to look very closely at the sources. So our mission for you today is to trace the timeline, outline the scope of the alleged fraud, and examine the intensely polarized responses from major political players.
And they are very polarized.
We've got Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent making direct claims about where the money went, and he's clashing openly with Representative Ilhan Omar over, well, both the facts and the political rhetoric.
And the foundation of this investigation, it actually stretches back a couple of years. The process really started gaining serious traction in 2022.
Oh, 2022.
Yeah, that's when the Biden administration began filing charges connected to what they initially described as the largest single pandemic fraud case in the U.S.
And when we look at the total financial damage in Minnesota, the numbers they're just hard to wrap your head around.
They are.
Sources report that the state is currently dealing with multiple fraud scandals that together total well over $1 billion in stolen taxpayer funds.
$1 billion. And the anchor case, the one that's gotten the most attention, centers on nearly $300 million, allegedly stolen from just one nonprofit.
Feeding Our Future.
That's the one. That organization became the main vehicle for what investigators have called a grift on a scale we've never seen before.
So what was the mechanism? How did it work?
Well, the whole thing depended on the rapid distribution of federal funds. Money meant for child nutrition programs, which had really relaxed oversight during the pandemic.
Right, they were trying to get money out the door fast.
Exactly. So the core of the alleged scheme involved groups lying about enrolling children in food programs, sometimes fabricating thousands of attendees, or using these incredibly cynical claims like pretending that children had autism just to qualify for higher funding levels.
And it wasn't just limited to the food programs, which is, that's critical to understand.
Right, it was pervasive. The fraud was seemingly everywhere in these relief initiatives. We saw an example in the Housing Stabilization Program.
The housing program, okay. That one was originally projected to cost the state, about $2.6 million over 4 years? A pretty modest number.
A very modest number. But the alleged fraudulent claims against it, they ballooned drastically, reaching a shocking $104 million.
Wow. That particular example it really highlights the systemic vulnerability, doesn't it?
It does. When state oversight failed to adapt to the speed of federal spending, these organizations were allegedly able to submit massive, unsupported claims and essentially just open the floodgates of federal money.
So given the sheer magnitude of the money involved, what has the legal system actually achieved so far? Any accountability?
The judicial outcomes are pretty significant, and they're ongoing. Across all the main fraud cases tied to this in Minnesota, a total of 87 people have been charged.
87?
Yeah.
And how many convictions?
Sources confirm that authorities have secured 61 convictions so far. And, we have to be impartial here, but the source material does specifically highlight a demographic detail that's become very politically charged.
Which is?
All but 8 of those charged are reported to be of Somali descent.
And to put a face on this, legally speaking, the alleged mastermind of the massive Feeding Our Future scheme, a woman named Amy Bach.
Yeah, Amy Bach. She was found guilty on all counts and is now awaiting sentencing. So this is a story with a developing timeline that's already delivering major judicial results. But it's the allegations about where the money ended up that truly turned this from a state scandal into a national crisis.
That's the crucial pivot, right?
Absolutely. The movement of these funds overseas, that's what brought in the highest levels of the federal government.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The financial mechanism is one thing, but what has really turned this into a national story are these high-stakes political responses. So let's look at the clash between the Treasury Department and Congress.
Okay.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been remarkably clear and very public about his department's investigation into whether some of this stolen taxpayer money was ultimately funneled to terrorist organizations.
In Somalia specifically.
Right.
And Bessent has stated publicly that the Treasury Department is actively tracking the flow of funds that have gone overseas. They're tracing money to both the Middle East and to Somalia, trying to determine how that money was ultimately used.
And he shared a highly technical detail that is just critical for understanding the challenge here. He explained the funds were allegedly moved via MBSs.
Right, and he had to immediately clarify that this did not mean mortgage-backed securities.
No, it meant money bureau services. Can you define what those are? Why is that detail so important?
Well, what's so fascinating here is that these money bureau services are essentially unregulated, or at least very loosely regulated, wire transfer organizations. Bessent describes them as operating entirely outside the normal banking system.
So they're designed to bypass the usual checks and balances.
Exactly. They bypass the standard know your customer and anti-money laundering regulations that, banks have to follow. So if you're an investigator trying to follow a money trail, tracking a wire through a standard U.S. bank it's relatively straightforward.
There's a digital paper trail.
A clear one. But tracking funds through one of these unregulated money bureau services, that is an entirely different and much, much more complicated challenge. It indicates a really intentional, sophisticated strategy to obscure the trail.
Now, Representative Ilhan Omar, who represents the district in Minnesota where a lot of this happened, she's a member of the Somali community. She has publicly challenged this whole narrative.
She has. Her response has been multi-pronged. She's emphasized that members of the Somali community are also Minnesota taxpayers, that they were supposed to be the beneficiaries of these programs, and that they are just as upset and angry about the fraud.
So she's trying to reframe the community as victims of the fraud, not collaborators.
That's the attempt. But she also directly rebutted the idea that the money went to terrorism. Omar stated that if stolen money had been funneled to terrorist groups, it would constitute, quote, a failure of the FBI and our court system.
For failing to detect it.
For failing to detect and prosecute it, yes. But critics, well, they pointed out that during one interview, Omar was observed giggling and laughing it off, which was, politically very damaging.
And that damage, it really stems from this whole web of documented political connections, doesn't it? Connections linking the Congresswoman and other top Minnesota leaders directly to some of the people who were charged and convicted.
It does. There are several direct links. First, she received campaign donations from people who were eventually charged in the scheme.
Those sources say that money was later returned.
It was returned, yes. But second, and you could argue this is more significant, she was the legislator who introduced the bill that either created or facilitated the program that was then defrauded of that $250 million.
So the legislator who wrote the very bill, the one that opened the door to the funds, is now facing scrutiny over the fraud committed against that same fund.
Precisely. And the optics are, well, they're challenging for her defense. She reportedly held a victory party at the Safari restaurant.
Which is co-owned by whom?
Co-owned by a man named Salem Ahmed Saad. He was later identified as a key player and was convicted of stealing over $12 million from the program.
And the connection extends to her staff as well, right?
It does. Another individual, Gahad Hashi, who previously worked on Omar's campaigns, pleaded guilty to stealing over $3 million.
And there are photos.
There are. Photos showing Omar and Governor Tim Walz posing with a man named Abdul Dahir Ibrahim. He's a man involved in the scandal who has had an order for removal from the U.S. since 2004, and he even had a prior conviction in Canada for asylum and welfare fraud.
These are not minor, distant acquaintances.
No. These are documented contacts with people right at the heart of the fraud.
That dense network of connections has led critics to move beyond just questioning oversight and to start directly alleging state complicity.
Right. You have House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer announcing a federal investigation. He's alleging that whistleblowers were intentionally ignored and that both the Attorney General Keith Ellison and the Governor Tim Walz turned a blind eye to it.
And these claims are pretty specific about the alleged motivation for this willful ignorance.
They are. A Somali-American fraud investigator reportedly told the New York Times that Governor Walz and other Democrats allegedly relied so heavily on Somali votes that they decided to look the other way.
The accusation is basically that the political reward outweighed the responsibility to enforce the law.
That is the core of the allegation. And there are also serious claims leveled directly against Attorney General Ellison in the sources.
What are those?
There are allegations that A.G. Ellison solicited political contributions from the very groups that were actively stealing money and, well, allegedly told them not to worry about the investigations. If that's true, it suggests a complete failure of the state's top legal officer.
And the regulatory failures are well documented. Let's go back to the housing program for a second.
Okay.
When the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, became aware of the massive fraud in that housing initiative, Minnesota's leadership insisted it could handle the cleanup itself.
They did. But that insistence quickly proved unsustainable. The state later had to admit that it couldn't contain the problem.
And that forced CMS to step in.
Right. They had to assert federal control and ultimately shut down the entire initiative. This whole timeline, it really seems to confirm the claims from critics that lacks state control, and ignoring external warnings enabled the massive scale of the theft.
And this entire financial and political mess has, maybe predictably, bled directly into the national culture war.
Absolutely, especially around issues of immigration and cultural identity.
It's been fueled in part by comments like those from Treasury Secretary Bessent, who used the fraud to call for immigrants to embrace an assimilation process. He framed it as needing to include, an appreciation for taxpayer dollars and American values.
That rhetoric immediately drew fire from Congresswoman Omar. She escalated the political language significantly. She compared Stephen Miller's rhetoric, not Bessent's, but Miller's, to, quote, the way the Nazis described Jewish people in Germany,
accusing him of using white supremacist rhetoric. The language on both sides is it's incredibly inflammatory.
And that divisiveness was amplified by former President Donald Trump. He weighed in with just extremely harsh commentary. He called Omar garbage and claimed the Somali community contribute nothing, even saying explicitly he doesn't want them in the country.
So a financial fraud case becomes a centerpiece of the national immigration debate.
In a heartbeat. And other political commentary has been equally biting. Republican Senator John Kennedy, for instance, called the whole case a clown world on steroids.
Just trying to capture the absurdity of it all?
I think so. And finally, there's one last layer of scrutiny to add. Commentators have asserted that Ilhan Omar's personal net worth has skyrocketed since she's been in Congress.
Is there a direct link established to the fraud?
No direct link, but one report pointed to a potential 3,500% increase in her net worth year over year based on public disclosures. And that inevitably fuels the critical narrative against her.
So what does this all mean? We've traced a massive billion-dollar financial scandal rooted in pandemic relief fraud. It's already resulted in 61 convictions. But the story has fundamentally morphed into this intense political fight.
A fight involving allegations of terrorism funding, serious questions of intentional complicity from top state leadership,
and a toxic national debate over immigration and accountability.
It really serves as a stark example of that critical tension that defined the whole pandemic era. You had this immediate, understandable need for speed and volume in getting relief funds out. But that often bypassed the crucial mechanisms you need for robust governance and financial oversight. And when that state oversight was overwhelmed, or, according to critics, maybe compromised for political gain, the systems were just ripe for exploitation on a massive scale.
And we keep coming back to that technical point you mentioned, the one from Treasury Secretary Bessent. The alleged transfer of funds overseas via these unregulated wire transfer organizations, the MBSs.
The Money Bureau Services.
That detail is perhaps the most forward-looking piece of this whole story.
Absolutely. So the final provocative thought for you to consider is this. Given what the Treasury is reporting, how effectively can any government oversight track massive financial fraud when perpetrators intentionally move funds outside of the conventional regulated banking system?
A system they designed to be untraceable.
Exactly. This reliance on unregulated wire services is a growing challenge for fraud investigation agencies worldwide. And this Minnesota scandal, it may only be the beginning of revealing a new, complex, global architecture of illicit finance that regulators now have to learn to navigate.
A truly challenging question for regulators and legislators moving forward. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Minnesota fraud scandal.
Thank you.